Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the keynote stage Distinguished Vice President, Gartner Research and Advisory, and Conference Co-Chair, David Cappuccio.
Good afternoon, everybody. Salim Ismail, Salim Ismail is a man who is passionate about business, entrepreneurship, and technology. He's a technology strategist, a software engineer, and a successful entrepreneur. Travels extensively, sharing a global perspective of the impact of breakthrough technologies and how organizations can leverage those to become 10 times faster than their peers. He spent the last 7 years building Singularity University as its founding executive director and current global ambassador. SU is based on NASA aims. Its goal is to educate, inspire, and empower a new generation of leaders to apply exponential technologies to address humanity's greatest challenges. So here to share with us today his view on exponential organizations, please help me welcome Salim Ismail.
Good afternoon, all. Quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of Singularity University? A few of you, okay. And how many of you have read the book? Anybody here? A couple of you? All right, a new crowd. All right, so you heard a little bit about my background. I'm actually Canadian, originally from India. I did my early years building large-scale enterprise software systems. Was an early principal at CSC, and then got into management consulting, got into entrepreneurship. I built a predecessor to Twitter in New York about 15 years ago, about 2 years too early, because nobody knew what to subscribe to and social networks hadn't come about. Really bad to be early, much better to be late in the entrepreneurship world. But that led to me joining Yahoo 10 years ago when Jerry Yang was CEO, and I ran Yahoo's incubator called Brickhouse. And had a couple of years of just an amazing time, but I learned a really fundamental lesson there, which is when you attempt disruptive innovation in any legacy environment, the immune system attacks you, right? Because all of our organizations are built to resist change, right, and withstand risk. And yet that's now the high order bit. And how do we juxtapose with that tension is almost all of the work that I do now. How do you solve this immune system problem, not just in organizations, but in institutions in general? If you try and update education, the teachers' unions go bananas, or if you try and update transportation, you have the fight between Uber and the taxis. And so almost all my work now is focused on that. Maybe the strangest phone call I received was last year from the Vatican saying, look, the Pope has the oldest immune system in the world, right? As he tries to update that organization, some interesting challenges on his hands. Singularity University, as was mentioned, is based at NASA in Silicon Valley. It's 10 years old, and it lives off this particular curve that Ray Kurzweil put together. It's basically a graph of Moore's law. And he goes all the way back to 1900 and finds that we've been doubling computational price performance for over 100 years, way before Gordon Moore made his predictions. And the question that he asked when he saw this data is, why is that curve so smooth and so predictable? Through wars and recessions and ups and downs in the industry, you should expect a very jagged stock market shape to this, right? Not this very steady progression we see. And Ray spent a full 10 years researching this, trying to understand why this was happening. And he came up with a really fundamental observation, which is once you turn any domain, discipline, industry area, product area, technology, and you power it with information technologies, and it acquires informational flow properties, the price performance starts doubling very steadily. Most importantly, once that doubling pattern starts, it does not stop. It just keeps going. And that's really hard to get our heads around. Cognitively, that doesn't make sense. But if you've seen in computation, depending on how long you've been in the industry, we've been through several technologies, transistors, vacuum tubes, relays, now integrated circuits. And we're actually reaching the end of the life cycle of integrated circuits, right? The chips are getting too hot down at the surface levels. We're down to a few nanometers wire thickness. You can think of each of these technologies as kind of an S-curve, where technology takes off, accelerates, reaches its upper limits. But if you have an information-based paradigm, something else always takes over the curve, And now, as we reach the end of the life cycle of integrated circuits, we're seeing now a set of technologies clustering at the edges of that: 3D chip design, optical computing. Probably quantum computing is the most likely to take over that curve, because that's not an invention problem anymore. It's now an engineering problem. And like anything, quantum requires a lot of alcohol to discuss, so I won't get into it here. But we fully expect Moore's law to continue and maybe even accelerate. So that's the key starting point. Peter Diamandis is the other main founder of Singularity. He wrote this book a few years ago called Abundance, charting out that if we could harness this pace of change effectively, that we'll soon have an abundance of healthcare, education, clean water, energy in about a decade. And what does the world look like if that's the case? That's the kind of basis and foundation of it. Peter is most famous for running the X Prize Foundation, which gives large public prizes wherever there are market failures. So the most famous is the $10 million Space X Prize, which was won by Burt Rutan and Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, and all of the commercialized space ventures have come from that world. And they found that if you offer a $10 million prize, 20 or 30 teams will spend about $150 million trying to win the $10 million. And so it's an incredibly effective way of generating innovation. I joined the board of X Prize last year, some really interesting people on that board. Pretty much every board meeting now starts with, what did Elon just do? And then we move on to the rest of the business of the day. And you know a lot of what I'm talking about. But that doubling pattern that we've noticed, and we've all lived through in our careers building systems, we're now seeing that doubling pattern in about a dozen technologies. And this is utterly unique. Never before in the history of mankind have we seen this many technologies move this quickly. In the past, maybe one technology accelerated or another. Never have we had this many moving this quickly. So for example, in neuroscience, the resolution at which we can image the brain is doubling every year. Drones are doubling every 9 months in their price performance. The speed at which we can sequence the human genome is doubling every 5 months in its price performance. And this is totally surreal. And so the aggregate effect becomes really profound, not just in the individual technologies, but the intersections add a whole other multiplier to the equation. And it's really hard to spot this pace of change. We don't cognitively, our brains aren't set up to see this. Quick show of hands, how many of you had heard of 3D printing 5 years ago? Can I just see a show of hands? Right, quite a few of you. Okay, 10 years ago? Okay, 15 years ago, a couple of you. So 3D printing is actually 35 years old. It is not a new technology. But when it first came out in the early 80s, the price performance was terrible. You could print out like 0.001 widgets an hour. 2 years later, it doubled to 0.002 widgets an hour. Right? 2 years later, it doubled to 0.004. 2 years later, 0.008. And for a long time, it looks like zero. And everybody ignores it. Then it hits like 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, 0.8, 1.6. Things are going crazy. Then we call it a black swan. And we found if you don't spot these doubling patterns early, they disrupt you really badly. But if you can spot them early, biggest advantage you could possibly have. And so that's the kind of heart of the thinking there. When you apply this to industries, we tend to see kind of 3 layers. The vast majority of all of our businesses and industries is at the bottom there. All of the value creation, business models, revenue came from the sheer physicality of the world. Right? We extract resources, we assemble raw materials, we ship things around, and so on. Then we added products like the Kindle and iPhone, where the product might be physical, but all the revenue generated is digitally driven, information-based. Right? And with the rise of mobile and internet, we now have entire industries in that world. And now we're kind of shifting the whole thing around, and we're seeing more and more technologies, more and more industries. Much of the work that you do is helping that pattern. I write in my book that the Tesla is not really a car with computers and sensors in it. It's a computer with wheels. Right? And you look at it very differently from that perspective. Actually, one of my alumni corrected me and said, you're wrong about that. Remember that the Tesla updates itself every few weeks, so you have to think of it as an app that has wheels, right? And that really kind of breaks your brain. But certainly the vector is correct and the directionality is correct. So with technology going at this speed, we're kind of seeing 4 forcing functions out in the world today. The first is very obvious. We're digitizing everything as fast as we can see. In many of your businesses, sensors are being slapped on anything that moves so we can track the data streams coming off it. In healthcare, we're correlating more and more data streams coming off our bodies and correlating them into interesting patterns. Here's one of my favorite examples of this kind of wave of digitization. This team out of Israel can take a 10-second clip of your voice, and just by analyzing the tone, they can assess your mood and your attitude to an 85% accuracy on like 400 different categories. Right? So customer service teams are using this today. If an angry customer calls, what's the underlying attitude? Right? Can you save the account, or should you just hang up and move on to the next one because you've lost them anyway? How do you think about that? You can actually download this app called Moody's if you want to try this out on yourself. Try this out on your spouse if you want to have an interesting discussion about their mood. That one doesn't go very well, of course. But it starts to get very weird. I was speaking at one of our conferences where we partner with CNBC. And while I was on stage, one of our alumni taped 13 seconds of my voice, and he showed it to the audience. So that was my mood and my attitude as I was speaking on stage, which gets really quite uncomfortable. Of course, he's totally wrong about the stubbornness, and I totally disagree with that. And you see how weird that gets as we kind of flip this whole paradigm around and kind of deal with this. And we found when you digitize something and you add this information basis, things get very disruptive. And the best framing we found for that is photography. Some of you are old enough to actually remember film photography. You're operating on a scarcity model, right? You can only carry so much film. It costs, what, $1 a photograph, takes a few days to get your prints back, and so on. When you move to digital photography and you move to the information-based environment, three fundamentally important things happen. First, marginal cost goes to zero. I can now take 1,000 photographs. The cost does not change at all. As a result of that, the domain completely explodes. Right? In film photography, I'm very carefully clicking here or carefully clicking there because each click is like $1. But today, we're basically holding the button down on all of our devices and taking billions of times more photographs because the cost is gone. Right? The third thing that happens is very subtle but really important, especially from a business perspective, is you shift the problem space. So in a scarcity problem space, I may sell really expensive cameras. I may offer courses on photography. I may publish books on composition, all to help people optimize that scarcity. Right? But in an abundance problem space, we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 devices, and you can't find anything. Right? You've gone from a sourcing problem to a filtering problem. All of your IT departments have an abundance of data that we're trying to figure out what to do with now, because all of these devices are churning out so much data. And the business model shifts. This is why we're seeing such disruption in our incumbent industries. Many of our incumbent industries are focused on helping people, but they're operating in a material scarcity, physical view of the world. And the world is shifting very fundamentally. Those technologies I mentioned are all going through this transition right now in a really fundamental way. I don't have time to go through all of them, but let me cover a couple of examples. And most importantly, what are the broader implications of that? If you go back on YouTube and search for a couple of the talks I've given in the past, you'll hear me proudly say that a drone can carry a 20-pound package about 10 kilometers. That's the range and capacity, say, 5 years ago. But as I mentioned, these drones are doubling every 9 months. And sure enough, like clockwork, they've gone from 20 to 40 to 80 to 160 to 320. And exactly like clockwork, Boeing now has a drone that can carry 600 pounds. Right? And this doubling pattern is totally fascinating to see how predictable it's been. Of course, now, more importantly, the next one will be 1,200 pounds. The one after that will be 2,400 pounds. And that doubling pattern will just keep going. And so we should aim for what that looks like. So I'm advising one of the port of Hamburg. They're trying to figure out how to kind of add capacity to the port. And I'm like saying, you don't need to build more cranes. In 2 years, these drones will be able to pick up a container and put it on land. You don't need any of the infrastructure that you used before. Right? So really new, fascinating use cases coming out of it. Here's one of the fascinating drones that I just saw. This thing goes underwater. So the drone drops down and now turns into like a submarine. Right? This is going to create all sorts of interesting applications in construction, bridge building, et cetera, as we do this. So because the cost has dropped so dramatically, you don't care if that thing breaks, because you can just throw it out and build a new one. But when it costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars per drone, that was a big deal. Here's one way I like to frame it. Here's a 700-year look at the cost of light, going from 1300 all the way to today. And the shape of this curve is really interesting. It used to be really expensive to light up a building or a room. Then we had candle technology, and that kind of helped quite a bit. And then literally we crashed it to near zero as we industrialized the heck out of it and optimized for all of the new world. And the shape of that curve is really fascinating, because here's the shape of the curve for DNA sequencing. And you see, again, the same shape. By the way, at this point here, just around the year 2000, it cost $2.7 billion to fully sequence the first human genome. The second one was about 400 million, the third one was about 50 million, fourth one was about 14 million. Does anybody know what it is today for a full sequence? It's $200. We've gone from almost $3 billion 15, 17 years ago down to $200 today. That's more than an order of magnitude of price change per year. Forget Moore's Law. This thing is blowing that away. Moore's Law is like pretty flat compared to what's happening here. In another year or two, it'll be about a penny. By about 2022, it'll be cheaper to sequence your genome than it will be to flush your toilet, right? And when you flush your toilet, we'll sequence everything in there. It'll be interesting to see what bacteria, viruses, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're going to take all of, in fact, they're calling the entire field digital biology now, because now we've now information enabled it. Now we have technologies like CRISPR. How many of you are familiar with CRISPR? Go check it out, CRISPR. We have now figured out how to write to the human genome really easily. We can now edit a human genome as easily as you can edit software. So a human being, which is basically 10 trillion cells, which each cell governed by the DNA telling it what to do, as a human being is now essentially a software engineering problem. And all of the skills you have that's been building up, that we've built in the industry for decades, can now be applied to biology. And people are now doing this. If you look at the news that came out this week, the Chinese are now editing babies live. Right? This is really happening. So really interesting implications there. But here's an even greater implication. Here's the solar energy. And you see, again, the same shape of the curve. Expensive plateaus, literally crashes. And in technology after technology, the cost is crashing pretty dramatically. And I'll give you two macro examples of where this is going to have pretty big disruption. One is autonomous cars and what happens with that. And the car is all sexy and so on, but we're much more interested in the broader implications. What happens once you have, say, a 20% penetration of autonomous cars? We've worked out that we'll see an increase in existing traffic capacity of between 10 to 15 times. Right? Not percent, times, because you don't need the gap between the cars, they don't have accidents, they don't need to park, et cetera, et cetera. Think about real estate values. Real estate values globally spike in the middle of big cities because it's so hard to get in and out. When it's 10 times easier to get in and out of a city, what happens to real estate? Already we can use Waze to time perfectly when I'm getting to my meeting, right? And so we'll see a really big disruption in real estate values as the expensive downtown condo starts becoming not so useful. And the suburbs will light up in an interesting way. Or once you have Uber or drones doing deliveries, think about the idea that our entire society is geographically based, right? And proximity based. Retail store locations, bank locations, voting districts, school districts, everything. When you lift that constraint, we can totally reorganize society. How will we choose to do it, right? And this is not kind of some fancy, great technology stuff. It's purely going to be an economics-driven structure. The cost of an autonomous car is about 1/10 of what it costs to have a human driver. And it just will make no sense. Already in Silicon Valley, nobody buys a second car. Use Uber to get around, right? And many of you have teenagers that are not bothering to get driver's licenses, right? And so very interesting to see what happens to that paradigm over time. It makes no sense to drive. By the way, my favorite statistic about autonomous cars and the problem of cars and so on, it turns out that 50%, here in the US, 50% of all legal court cases, 50% car accident related. Right? So if you automate, you can get rid of a bunch of lawyers at the same time. That's going to be pretty awesome. Who can complain about that, right? And so really amazing. But for sure, the biggest disruption we're going to see, certainly in our lifetimes, is going to be solar energy. Because it turns out solar energy is driving and riding on this doubling pattern, doubling about every 22 months. And if you can see the numbers, it's been doing this for 40 years. So for 40 years, we've been very steadily doubling the price performance of solar roughly every 2 years. At this pace, we will be able to deliver 100% of world energy supply with solar in 13 years, which will totally blow open global geopolitics, right? The Middle East collapses. I joke as a Canadian that the US will have to find other reasons to go to war. All sorts of interesting patterns around that. Russia, the only asset they have is oil and gas. As the value of that goes to zero, what are they going to do? In fact, they're practicing on the Ukraine. They're going to have to invade the rest of Europe. And so really interesting implications there. By the way, the poorest countries in the world are the sunniest countries in the world. So this is totally going to change the paradigm around. Here's the relative cost of solar to other fuels. Look at that unbelievable multiplier. 2 years ago, it became cheaper than the energy coming off the US grid, unsubsidized, by the way, unsubsidized. And today, every new major power generation project is solar-based. We will never build another coal-fired or oil-based plant, not for any economics, but not for any ideological reasons, just the pure economics of it. I showed you this curve already. Two really important things about this. If we hit 100% and we can deliver 100% in, say, 13 years, and it's doubling every 2 years, that means in 15 years we can deliver 200% of global energy supply. Right? In 17 years, we can deliver 400%. In 19 years, we can deliver 800%, and that just keeps going. So energy, which has been scarce for the entire history of humanity, now becomes abundant. And that will completely change how we think about the world in a really dramatic way. We're starting to see this already. About a quarter of the farms in California are now fully solar powered. The country of Chile in South America, Chile is already today generating so much solar, they're giving it to their neighbors for free. That's happening right now. And maybe in the ultimate of all ironies that I've found, the Coal Museum in Kentucky is using solar panels to power itself. I just don't know how you look in the mirror on this one, right? This is very surreal. And we see when you have these transitions, these weird, chaotic type of side effects and events coming along. Now the big challenge is storage. How do you deal with the storage effects around this? Utilities are pumping water up hills and then using hydro at night to deal with this. Battery technology is lagging behind solar by about 6 years. But by about 2024, 25, when you have solar and battery technology at the same level of maturity, it turns out that every business model, the business model of every utility in the world disappears, right? Because if I have solar and storage, I don't need a utility. And so that's going to be an interesting perturbation there. I gave a talk a couple of years ago to all the 200 CEOs of all the electrical utilities in the country. There was kind of a big silence at the end of that discussion. And so really huge implications there. And it turns out, by the way, if you're worried there's not enough solar out there, it turns out if you add up all of the fossil fuel reserves we have in the whole world, all of the coal, all the oil, all the natural gas in the whole world, that adds up to 5 days of sunlight hitting the world. So that shifts the conversation from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem, and the conversion is riding this pattern. And so a pretty huge thing. So this will happen, and it's just a question of how. So I actually tried to live this myself. If you're going to talk about this, you have to be able to have some sort of experiential basis for this. So a couple of years ago, I took a Tesla, and I drove it from Miami all the way up to Toronto. I'd stop at the charging stations. The car drove itself. I get on the highway, and I hit the button for autonomous driving, and the car drove itself about 35% of the time. Okay? And I'd stop along the way, and off I went. A few months ago, I actually drove it back. So it was a slightly shorter trip. Here are the relative numbers. It was a slightly shorter trip on the way back. But look at that final line. When I drove it up, the car drove itself 35% of the time. When I drove it back, same car, same sensors, now it's driving itself 80% of the time. There is Moore's law in full live action right there. Same car, same sensor, just better data, better software, better analytics. That many more cars have gone down the street, etc. Now, most importantly, I crossed the entire country, 2,500 kilometers. In fact, the car essentially took me. It was like having a first-class private train cabin, and it cost me $0 because the charging stations are free, right? Now when my wife says, hey, let's go down to Florida, I say to her, you fly, I'll take the car. It's way more fun. I made about 60 conference calls along the way, right? And so this is a really big paradigm shift because I can cross the country now for $0 cost. That's pretty incredible. And I call this a Gutenberg moment. In the 15th century, the printing press democratized printing of the Bible, and it totally changed society, and that's called the Gutenberg moment. I will argue today that we have about 20 such Gutenberg moments hitting us all at the same time, because just AI changes everything. Then you add in blockchain, then you add in solar, autonomous cars, biotech, neuroscience breakthroughs, robotics. This is totally unique in the history of humanity. We've never seen this before. And the technologies are all very sexy. We could go on for quite a while. But we have an enormous challenge as a society, because as a society, we are not able to absorb this pace of change. In fact, every mechanism we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, our healthcare systems, intellectual property, all driven they're structured for a world a few hundred years ago, not for today. Definitely not for the trillion sensors coming down the pike. In fact, every institution we use to run the world is in kind of major stress today, right? Take democracy. We invented representative democracies when information was scarce. If you're in Washington, D.C., you literally had no idea what was happening in California. The speed of a horse was as fast as you could find out. So you had people come once in a Congress met occasionally, or the Senate meets occasionally, for people to give people time to cross the country and say, here's what my people are thinking. Except today we have an abundance of information. We know exactly what people are thinking. We don't need the representative, which can get corrupted along the way, and has. And every major democracy in the world is broken. India is broken, Brazil is broken, the UK broke 2 years ago, the US breaking right now in front of our eyes. Right? And it's a huge structural issue on how you solve for this in many ways. Or take education. All our education systems are designed to take a young child, train them through their early 20s to be ready for the existing job market. Except we have no idea what a job looks like in 5 years. What are we teaching them? Right? That's on a slightly lighter note, take the institution of marriage. We invented marriage about 10,000 years ago, and when that first surfaced as an institution, average lifespan was about 23. So you got married and you had kids and you died. Marriage is not designed to last 50, 60 years, right? My wife calls that state-sanctioned torture, basically, right? And how do you update? Then we moan about the divorce rate, but it's simply not designed for the world that we're living in. And we're about to double human lifespan in the next couple of decades. Are you supposed to live with the same person for 100 years? That is crazy talk, right? And so really fascinating to see what's going to happen there. Now, from an economic perspective, we're seeing kind of two major things happen. The biggest one is the metabolism is accelerating. It used to take 20 years to create $1 billion marketplace. Now we're seeing that happen in months. But this curve is what I find very interesting. This is the deflationary cliff that hit when we fully digitized newspapers and we went end-to-end digital. You don't see a gradual slowdown. It suddenly stops. We saw the same thing in the music industry. It went along like this, and then boom, a sudden cliff. The TV industry is suffering that cliff right now. Right? Media buying is catching up to the fact that very few people are watching ads, and we're moving to a subscription model. I predict that cliff hits the car industry in about 4 years or 5 years. And so we'll see that kind of same pattern happen. It really speaks to how hard this is to spot. And I want to spend a couple of minutes on this. I think this is the single most important paradigm I could get through to you. Cognitively, our brains, our education, our intuition, our training about the world does not set us up to look at this and track this curve. We kind of track it intuitively in the IT world. But when the Google car first came out 10 years ago, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the radar, the sensors added up to about $200,000 a car. And all the car companies looked at that and said, cute research project. We'll never commercialize that. 2 years later, it dropped by 50% to $100,000 a car. 2 years later, $50,000 a car, right? And still the response was, who will pay $50,000 for all those sensors? We're down below $1,000 a car today. For everything. Now everybody's freaking out. That LiDAR unit at the top of that Prius cost $75,000 6 years ago. You can get that today for about $40. Why? Because there's 3 or 4 technologies in it. Each one is doubling and dropping 50% a year, and the aggregate effect is profound. If you go back to 2012 and tell gurus in the car industry that this was going to happen, they will laugh you out of the room. And of course, the next version is going to be $10, and it will dematerialize into our smartphones the same way we've seen GPS systems dematerialize. And when you can have kind of a LiDAR detector on your smartphone, also, or every truck, or every tractor, or every warehouse that you have, really interesting data streams will come from that. And you'll all be stuck having to manage it all. Sorry about that, right? But this may be the curve that I think really nails this. So what you see in the black there is the actual growth exponential of solar energy. And we've seen this over the last couple of decades growing like an absolute rocket. What you see in the colored lines are the estimates from the World Energy Organization, the top energy experts in the world predicting what will happen to solar. And what you see is that every single year when they make the predictions, even though the curve is exponential, they go linear. Right? Every single year, even like 10 years in, they're watching this for 10 years go like this, and they go, no, it'll go this way. And look at the gray one there at the top. Some of them even go down. How do you think solar goes down? It blows my mind, right? And now, we are making strategic predictions about the world from these curves, and they're all wrong, very badly wrong. And how do you get around that? Because many of our companies are filled with experts that have 10, 20, 30 years expertise in that domain, whether it's energy, whether it's car technology, whatever. And the reason this is unstoppable and kind of inexorable is this final piece. Today, as the cost of these technologies drops, a domain becomes digital, the costs disappear, you get open source technology, communities forming, and then you get radical disruption of the status quo. And whether it's drones or biotech or Bitcoin or solar, this is all happening across all of these, right? Today, any entrepreneur can enter a legacy industry with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and totally disrupt it. Elon Musk may be one of the best examples. No experience in the car sector, energy industry, or the space sector, and yet he's created market leaders in all of them. By the way, his methodology is very simple. He looks at a technology that's growing exponentially. He aims 10 years out. Where will that technology be in 10 years on the doubling pattern? And then he builds a company aiming to intercept that curve in 10 years. Because it takes about 10 years to properly build a company. And he's done that repeatedly. That's his MO. With the Hyperloop, he wants to go from LA to San Francisco in 20 minutes at about 4,000 miles an hour. And to give you a sense of this, I was chatting with him about this. And I said, Elon, I have a degree in physics. If you try and accelerate a human being from 0 to 4,000 miles an hour and then decelerate them back to 0 in 20 minutes, you're probably going to kill them, right? And his response was, yes, it's an issue, okay? Yeah, it's an issue, right? And I'm thinking, so, and what's important, in this situation, I'm the expert, right? I'm going, this is impossible, you're crazy. He's like, yeah, it's a problem, right? Now, what's important is I would have stopped. I would have stopped. I was the immune system in that point, right? I'm saying, you can't do this. It's impossible. And he's like, yeah, we have to overcome this. And now we have tens of thousands of entrepreneurs operating like this. Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum, was told by all of his professors, you can't do this. It's not possible. And boom, he's created something that will change the world, right? So this really is quite pervasive, and I'll give you another example. You can get today $100 headsets that give you a pretty good fidelity readout as to what brainwave frequencies you're going through your brain. If you can see the silhouette, that's me on the left wearing a headset, that's the readout from my brain. And on the right here is a guy called Will Henshaw taking the photograph. He's the composer for this. He used to play guitar for the Eurythmics, the band from the 80s. What Will is doing, he's composing music that when you play the music, it puts your brain in a focus state. Right? So if you have software development teams, or if you're a student, or if you're a knowledge worker, this is powerful. Here's my brain before and after he plays the music, and you can see my brain is flooded with alpha waves, indicating I'm in a deep focus state. Right? Think of how disruptive this is. If you're the CEO of Red Bull, you need to be seriously worried about this, right? But you won't see it coming. You think your competition's 5-hour energy and Starbucks and so on. We call this the orthogonal effect of innovation and disruption. I wrote my whole book listening to this music, by the way, and it turns out, as a side effect, this music turns out to be better for all of the kids with ADD and ADHD than any of the drugs we're giving them. Right? So really profound implications there. And of course, no pharma company will look at that. Now we're opening everything up. How many of you know this kid? This kid's name is Ryan. He's the richest YouTube star in the world. He's 7 years old. Okay? This 7-year-old kid, you want to talk about democratization? This 7-year-old kid is making $22 million a year as a YouTube star. He does reviews of toys. And millions of other 7-year-olds are watching this. This is just ridiculous. So if you have a 7-year-old, get them on YouTube and start earning money off them, because clearly there's a market in there. The point is, though, that in the past, if you wanted to make $22 million a year, you had to do all sorts of crazy things. And today, you can really democratize that. Anybody, if they hit the right meme, it goes viral, off you go. So the question was, with all of this disruption coming, 20 Gutenberg moments hitting us, etc., how do you respond? How do you adapt to this new world? David Rose, one of the godfathers of angel investing, made this comment a few years ago, and this has been stuck in my head for quite a few years. And he makes the point that all of our organizations are top-down hierarchical structures designed for efficiency and for predictability. Right? We're trying to deliver the same product or service in 1,000 locations. We're using the same back-end software, et cetera, et cetera. But today, the world doesn't operate on this heuristic. Today, you have to be adaptable, flexible, agile, fast. And it's simply our old way of organizing ourselves, and many of these old organizations don't operate this way. And we noticed that over the last, say, 10 years or so, since the rise of Amazon Web Services, we have a totally new breed of startup that's emerging that is scaling in a way we've never seen before. And we call these exponential organizations. We're tracking an index of over 100 of these. The minimum definition requirement to be one of these is you have to be delivering 10 times better, faster, cheaper than your competitors in the same space. Okay? How many of you are familiar with GitHub? Hopefully a large number in this room, right? GitHub is our poster child. They're the most exponential company we ever came across. We have a diagnostic survey, and out of a score of 84, they scored 76. They have a social platform where developers can collaborate more effectively. Microsoft just bought them for $7.5 billion. Okay? More importantly, though, that's a nice price tag, but more importantly, GitHub has no workforce, no assets, no intellectual property. Okay? I'm just going to repeat that. No assets, no workforce, no intellectual property, $7.5 billion. Something different is happening in the world today. And a lot of these companies don't have a lot of assets, don't have a lot of workforce, etc. When Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, Nokia decided they have to go and figure out what to do and defend themselves. So they went and spent $8 billion buying the company Navtech that owns all the traffic circle sensors in many cities, 500 cities around the world. And they figured, let's get the lock on it. At the same time, Waze starts piggybacking off the GPS off your phone. And they looked at Waze, they said it has no users. They didn't notice it was doubling every 6 months in their user base. And 5 years later, Nokia gets sold for $7 billion, less than what they paid for Navtech. And Waze gets sold for $1 billion with 100 employees. And more importantly, 100 million data points, because they have 100 million smartphones with the software. Right? And this is the big challenge. And how do you do this? How do you scale in a totally different way? Another example is TED. 10 years ago, it's a nice conference. Chris Anderson takes it over. He does 3 things. He establishes a huge purpose, ideas worth spreading. Then he gives all the TED Talks away for free on YouTube. And then he allows anybody to go create a TEDx event. Right? And in 10 years, he's created a global media brand. Nobody has ever done that before, and his cost of doing this is almost 0. So you can take an established environment, apply a set of principles, blow it open to a global level at 0 cost. This is pretty incredible. Another example in a more traditional industry is this car company, Local Motors. They have a social network of about 120,000 car mechanics, car enthusiasts that help them design cars. And the numbers are kind of amazing. If you're a typical car company, Ford, Toyota, BMW, it costs about $3 billion to design a new car from scratch. They can do it for 1,000 times cheaper. Typical car has 25,000 parts, theirs has 50. Again, about 1,000 times. Typical assembly time is about 1,000 man-hours for a typical car, theirs is about 1. And a typical car takes about 1 million square feet of factory space, and theirs can be built on the size of this stage, or about half the stage. So here are 4 metrics on which they're blowing away the status quo on multiple orders of magnitude each. How do you compete with that? Right? You can't. You have 3 options. Number 1, buy them, shut them down, right? Which is a favorite tactic in some industries. But now there's so many because of the democratization, you can't do that. Number 2, lobby the government, pass legislation. There's no way that car should be safe, and regulate them out of existence, right? That's the second option. But that takes too long today. Uber is successful by deliberately breaking the law, leapfrogging to public acceptance, and waiting for policy to catch up. Right? Not very pleasant, but it's certainly working for them. Third, figure out what they're doing and reverse it back into your organization, which is obviously the recommended tactic. So there's 3 components that go into building one of these. The first is they all have what I call a massive transformative purpose, an MTP. Every single one of these has one of these, like Google, organize the world's information, Uber, everybody's private driver, Singularity, go impact 1 billion people positively using accelerating technologies, etc. We're now starting to see brands morph into this. You see at the bottom Coca-Cola's recent mantra, open happiness. In fact, Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, 3 years ago read my book, and he ordered every brand in Unilever to take on a massive purpose. And now the 5 most profitable brands are the ones that did it the most. So we're starting to see the model bite quite a bit. Then there's 5 externalities. The second component is 5 externalities that these companies use that allows them to keep a really small footprint and scale very quickly. Right? Uber doesn't hire its own staff. TED is using community. Google is using algorithms. Airbnb is leveraging other people's bedrooms, and so on. By the way, how many of you are familiar with Kaggle? Quick show of hands. So Kaggle is something worth knowing about. It's a software platform and a social network of about 500,000 data scientists. So today, if you try and hire a data scientist, they're really hard to find, right? Then they're really hard to hire because they all want to work for Google or LinkedIn or somebody. And if you hire them, they're really hard to manage. They speak geek and they have weird hours and some of them smell, et cetera, right? But if you can go on a platform and hire them on demand, why do you need to hire them? And so you can take a data set, and I encourage you to try this. Take a data set, go onto Kaggle and run a contest. In fact, we convinced the CEO of Allstate to put his claims algorithm up on Allstate. And he said, listen, I have the 50 of the best actuarial scientists in the world. That's the old name for data scientists, by the way, the actuaries. And I have 50, they've been working on this algorithm. We've been curating this algorithm on who will have the next accident for 60 years. There's no way somebody outside will know what the industry better than us and come up with a better algorithm. We said, well, let's try it out. So we anonymized some data so we could backtest against it, put it up, and said, here's a $10,000 prize. Who in this community thinks they can come up with a better algorithm than the status quo? Their core algorithm was beaten within 3 days. Okay? And by the end of the contest, it was 270% better. Not 5, not 10%, 3 times better. Why? Because the smartest people in the world don't work for you. They don't even work for Google. They work all over the place. And if you can access them, why do you need to hire them? But in fact, Kaggle has run about 150 such contests with corporate clients, and the status quo has been beaten 100% of the time. And that's pretty interesting. And so here are 5 externalities that people use. Then there's 5 internal mechanisms like the real-time dashboard, the whole lean startup methodology, decentralized org structures. We have really good evidence that social technologies like Slack, Yammer, Chatter, and the creating collaborative peer-to-peer connections between employees creates a much more powerful communication pattern, much more valuable than our traditional top-down hierarchical structures. And if you can fully deploy social technologies, you don't need the org structure, okay? How many of you are familiar with Valve software, right? So Valve is a software company out of Seattle. They make the steampunk gaming platform that all your kids use without you realizing it. They have 400 people. They have no CEO, no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no middle management of any kind. They literally operate like a beehive. So if I spot a bug in the software, or if one's reported, I grab 3 people that I think can fix that bug. We go fix it, and we disband. Each employee self-selects as to what they want to do. And it sounds like a joke, but they get more revenue per employee than Microsoft by doing this. They make a fortune. Because it turns out everybody naturally gravitates to where they work the best, and they work out the collaboration patterns amongst them. The poster child of this is this Chinese appliance manufacturer called Haier. They make 55 million fridges and ovens a year. Had 80,000 people operating in a classic hierarchical structure. And the CEO looked at his organization a few years ago and decided, I can't meet my corporate goals. Blew it up. Turned 80,000 people operating in a very specific hierarchical structure into 2,000 autonomous teams of about 40 people each. Each team elects their own leader. Each team has a P&L. Each team decides whatever they want to do. Now, you go to anybody and say, I want to make 55 million fridges and ovens a year, and they will tell you you need a ton of product strategy, demand forecasting, inventory management, et cetera, right? Turns out you don't. Who knew, right? And they've tripled their market cap by doing this. And the reality is there's simply no MBA program that teaches you this. There's no MBA program in the world that can teach you how to build Uber. Right? This is the big challenge. And we found that not everybody does all of these, but if you fully implement 4 out of 10, you get a 10x performance improvement in your organization. And we're starting to see the model kind of bite. We kind of ranked the top 100. We took the Fortune 100, and we actually ranked them on how flexible and adaptable they are. So there's the full list, and we'll share these slides with you. And it turns out that this correlates with stock market performance. And more interestingly, if you'd invested in the most 10 or 15 most flexible organizations on our index, you would have outperformed the S&P by about 3 times. And so really organizing yourselves to be way more flexible and agile, which you're all doing in IT departments, but now the company needs to do it, is something mandatory. And you can go beat the CEO over the head with this because he cannot ignore this. Right? They have to realize that organizing not just the IT function to be agile, Scrum, et cetera, but everything is really, really necessary. Now, when we talk to big companies, we have 2 pieces of advice. First, update your leadership that we are in a new world. You know, you take, say, BMW, their tagline is "we're the ultimate driving machine," except we're pretty clear nobody's going to be driving, right? So that's a pretty big tension that they have to navigate as a whole company. Every manufacturing specification, every engineering design, every design aesthetic is saying optimize for the driver, and the world goes totally the opposite way. But the most important recommendation we have is do not do disruptive innovation inside the mothership. It's not designed for it. You'll get this immune system response. Sometimes you're the immune system, right? You're trying to say, hey, I'm trying to keep the trains running. What the hell are you giving to me over here? I can't deal with this. And totally appropriately. Our strong recommendation is do it at the edge, pointing away from the core organization. Larry Page came to me a few years ago and said, hey, your unit at Yahoo is really successful. Should I do that at Google? And I said, no, you'll have this immune system response, but do something like it. And you see the response with Google X, where they have their core information management capabilities, and they add hardware to the edge. At the edge is Google Glass, contact lenses, Google Car, Loon, et cetera, to go into adjacent spaces. The master of this technique is Apple. And yes, they have a great design capability and a technology supply chain. I will argue that Apple's real innovation is organizational, okay? Because what they do, unlike anybody else in the world, is they'll form a small team that's really disruptive. They'll take them to the edge of the organization. They will keep them completely stealth and secret, and they will say to them, go disrupt another industry. Right? Nobody does this. Nobody's even noticed that this is what they do. So they have a portfolio of teams looking at different industries, and when they think something is ready for disruption, they go into it, fold it back into the iTunes platform. Now, if they would only fix iTunes, then the world would be a much, much better place, right? So they did it with phones, and then tablets, and then music, and then now retail, cars, payments. There's no limit to their market cap. And as we enter a world where either you're the disruptor or you're being disrupted, we all have to follow suit. You have to move to the cloud. We have to kind of outsource a lot of our IT to make it more flexible and agile in a way we've never did. And we see companies, some successful, some failing at this. A good success story is Nespresso. For years, they ran it inside Nestle, and it was just a mess. And then they put it outside because it's really a separate business. And boom, it exploded, and now it's a $6 billion line of business for Nestle. A great failure mode is Walmart, which realized 10 years ago they had to compete with Amazon, that this whole e-commerce thing was not a fad. So they set up a team in Bentonville, because they had the best distribution, logistics, inventory systems in the world, and said, let's go beat Amazon. Within 18 months, the immune system had killed it. All the existing executives said, we shouldn't do that, we should optimize for our own stores, look at that PE ratio, Amazon will never succeed, etc. So they did it a second time, and they put a team at the edge. But they still said, use our existing capabilities, we have the best in the world. Business figured it out, 18 months later, that was dead. So they did it a third time. Third time, they made the very courageous decision, go to the edge and build your own independent supply chain, inventory, distribution systems, even though we have the best in the world, because we keep messing this up. It started to succeed, then the business saw it, got excited, pulled it in, and killed it, right? And you think about the churn, the opportunity cost, the money, the time, right? The fourth time, finally, they did it independently, separately, and only after it achieved critical mass did they start stitching the back ends together. But in that intervening 8 years, Amazon's gone. And it's really hard to catch up after that. And so this is the top, and these are smart people. There's simply no MBA program that can teach you this. There's no business manual that can teach you how to do this. We are starting to see companies kind of get this little by little. Microsoft has done an unbelievable job moving to a subscription model from a product sales model. Here's a company creating a vertical farm. You can actually, that's a guy sitting at the bottom. You can actually feed a whole neighborhood sustainably doing with this. Does anybody know who's doing this? This is actually IKEA. Right, so you're using their core capabilities to go into an adjacent space. Of course, there's a ton of extra spare parts left over when you finish building that. I don't want to be anywhere near that. But now we're starting to see this accelerate. Corona is about to spend $4 billion on marijuana. Clearly, there's a business model in messing with people's brains. Nestle is about to do the same thing, using personalized DNA to create personalized diets, right? What we've been doing over the last 3-4 years is working on what we call an EXO sprint. And this is a 10-week process, which we're now open sourcing, which moves leadership, culture, management thinking 3 years ahead in 10 weeks. We piloted this with Procter & Gamble 3 years ago. We took their shared services division and totally transformed it. And we moved their entire division, 7,000 people, ahead very quickly in 10 weeks. So we're pretty excited about this. We've now done it a dozen times with TD Ameritrade, Black & Decker, HP, Visa. And we're actually launching a book that came out last week. Basically, that's a manual that anybody can take and run, because every one of the Global 5,000, in our opinion, has to go through this process with or without us. Because the metabolism of the outside world now exceeds that of our internal organizations, right? And that's not sustainable over time. So to give you some sense of it, I'll give you 3 things you can do internally and 3 things externally. Internally, run a sprint. We've kind of open sourced it. Number 2, get focus at will for all your people. If they can focus, we found that you get 500% more productivity when you're in a focused state. So that's kind of a no-brainer. Third, the Amazon institutional yes. So in any company, it's really easy to say no to an idea, right? In fact, 1 of 20 people can say no, it kills the idea. Amazon has a policy called the institutional yes. So if you come to me inside Amazon, my default answer has to be yes. I'm not allowed to say no to a new idea. If I want to say no, I have to write a 2-page thesis as to why it's a bad idea and post it publicly, right? So they've created friction and embarrassment to saying no, meaning that many more ideas get tried out and get tested all the way through. And one of the results of this was actually Amazon Web Services. Nothing to do with their core business. Nobody could figure out how to say no to it, but now it's one of the most successful products of all time, right? So I would do that internally. Externally, if you're in a legacy organization, you cannot do disruptive innovation. It's too hard to get the mindset. So partner with entrepreneurs and test that. Or 2, do what Facebook is doing and buy the startups that are disrupting you. Facebook did a pretty good job early on in buying WhatsApp, buying Instagram, and now you can see the corporations kind of trying to pull them in, and it's going to ruin them if it does, right? We'll see. And most importantly, we find that we're moving from classic top-down operating companies to platforms to more ecosystems, and that's where we see the evolution of business going. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much for your time. There'll be a book signing a bit later, I think, but it's been great to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you.